The previous video introduced important macroeconomic topics including measuring output for a nation, aka GDP, why nominal GDP needs to be adjusted for changes in the price level to calculate real GDP, the importance of economic growth, the business cycle, unemployment, and inflation. Assuming students have mastered these macroeconomic foundational principles and concepts, time to move on to basic macroeconomic relationships. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes, British economist, published a book which would change the approach to an understanding of macroeconomics. The title of the offering, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Against the backdrop of Keynesian ideas, time to establish basic macroeconomic relationships. So, Keynes identified the relationship between income, consumption, and savings. DI equals C plus X. Fun, more initials. What is DI? DI is disposable income. So after-tax income. Human beings work, individuals receive compensation for employment, and after paying taxes, they're left with disposable income. People who have disposable income have two choices what to do with it. C is consumption expenditures on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services, and S is savings. For Keynes, the level of economic activity in the nation is directly related to the amount of income generated from economic production. He also thought it was important to establish an understanding of how the level of consumption and the level of savings was calculated, all related to the level of disposable income. So for an individual or the country, if we're interested in calculating how much consumption expenditures take place, we simply take the level of disposable income and subtract how much was saved. Likewise, if we wanted to know how much savings took place over a period of time, typically 1 year, we just take disposable income and we subtract out consumption. These basic macroeconomic relationships are important to understanding the Keynesian view of macroeconomics. Building on the macroeconomic concepts introduced on the previous slide and the Keynesian relationship between disposable income, consumption, and savings, let's build out the average propensity to consume and average propensity to save as macroeconomic tools to understand spending at both the individual level and the nation as an entirety. Assume a person makes a certain amount of money after taxes. So they make money, they pay taxes, they have disposable income. Certain percentage of that they spend, certain percentage of that they save. These ideas are called the average propensity to consume and average propensity to save. In macroeconomics, we're generally more interested in the nation as a whole. 330 million individuals in this country, citizens of this great nation, approximately 166 million members of the workforce. How much total disposable income is generated from economic activity? And of that total disposable income, what percentage is spent, average propensity to consume, and what percentage is saved, average propensity to save? Use some simple numbers. Assume that the total income generated by individuals working in the country is $10 trillion. That would be the denominator on both the left and the right. If we're trying to calculate the average propensity to consume, in other words, on average, how much of their disposable income do Americans spend? Let's say that in total, $9 trillion was spent. So total consumption, $9 trillion over total income, $10 trillion. On average, Americans spent 90% of their income. Obviously, they saved the rest of it. So on the right-hand side, we'd have $1 trillion over $10 trillion, or 10%. Americans on average saved 10% of their income. Very important to identify the concept that the average propensity to consume and average propensity to save must add up to 1. In our previous example, $10 trillion worth of income, disposable income from Americans from working activities, $9 trillion spent, $1 trillion saved. Average propensity to consume 90%, average propensity to save 10%, 90 plus 10, 100% of the income is accounted for. Average propensity to consume and average propensity to save, introduced on the previous slide, are best examined and analyzed with actual numbers to confirm our understanding of these concepts. So remember, disposable income, after-tax income, two choices, consumption and savings. Joe Q. Public, Jane Q. Public makes $50,000 this year after taxes. Spend $45,000, save $5,000. Consumption plus savings equals disposable income. What was the average propensity to consume for this individual? Okay, well, how do we calculate average propensity to consume? It's the level of consumption over the level of income. So it's 45 over 50. That works out to be 90. This person spent 90% of their income. And they saved 5 over 50, 10% of their income. Remember, average propensity to consume plus average propensity to save must add up to 1 or 100% of income. Remember, generally more concerned about macroeconomic in total, disposable income, consumption, and savings, that relationship, the Keynesian idea, building out average propensity to consume and average propensity to save by comparing what percentage of disposable income is spent, consumption, and what percent is saved. 2021, in this great nation of the USA, $15 trillion worth of disposable income generated from roughly $22 trillion worth of real GDP. So after-tax income flowed to Americans $15 trillion. How much of that did Americans spend? These numbers are generated to demonstrate the point and confirm the theory of average propensity to consume and save. Let's assume that Americans spent 90% of the $15 trillion in disposable income. That works out to be $13.5 trillion. So average propensity to consume, 13.5 over 15 trillion equals 0.9 or 90%. On average, Americans spent 90% of their income. That doesn't mean everyone spent exactly 90%. Some Americans spent 100%. Actually, some may have spent 105% by borrowing through credit cards and such. Some only spent 80%, but on average, Americans spent 90% of their income. Whatever is not spent is saved. So if the average propensity to consume is 0.9, average propensity to save is 0.1 or 10%. 1.5 trillion over 15 trillion works out to be 10%. On average, Americans saved 10% of their disposable income. Observe international data among various industrialized countries across the globe to reinforce the concepts of average propensity to consume and average propensity to save. Remember, whatever percentage of income is not consumed is saved, and vice versa. Compare Finland and Spain at the top of the chart with Sweden and Switzerland at the bottom. What conclusion can you make? Finland and Spain actually experience what is referred to as dis-savings, negative savings, because on average people in Finland and citizens of Spain spent more than their disposable income. How is this possible? By borrowing against future earnings through credit cards and loans. At the other end of the spectrum, Sweden and Switzerland, extremely low in comparison to these other industrialized countries. Average propensity to consume, which means the average propensity to save in Sweden and Switzerland is rather large. United States falls somewhere in the middle. Average propensity to consume in the good old US of A, approximately 93.5%. That is to say, Americans save about 6.5% of their income on average. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. Economic thinking is marginal thinking because most decisions involve changes in the status quo. After establishing average propensity to consume and average propensity to save, it's important to identify how marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save are calculated and what their economic importance is to this macroeconomic relationship learning. Look at the formula down bottom for both marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. Be careful, it looks similar to average propensity to consume and save, but notice the word change. Change in consumption over change in income and change in savings over change in income. Individuals and as a whole the nation, the level of income changes from year to year. What percentage of that change in income is spent on consumer goods, durable goods, non-durable goods, and services, and therefore what percentage is saved? Important to understand these concepts because we're going to employ these statistics, the marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save, to calculate another macroeconomic tool known as the multiplier. Again, numbers make this far more apparent or understandable from the learning perspective. Same individual we analyzed earlier, Joe Q. Public, Jane Q. Public, they were making $50,000 annual disposable income. Notice here it says they earn an additional $5,000. So last year 50,000 disposable income, this year 55, the additional 5K in disposable income. All right. So let's assume that these individuals spend 4,000 of the additional 5,000 and therefore save 1,000 of the additional 5,000. Calculate marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. Remember, MPC is simply change in consumption over change in income. Therefore, the denominator is going to be 5,000, the additional disposable income. And for the marginal propensity to consume, the numerator is 4,000. Individuals spent $4,000 of their additional $5,000, working out to be a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8 or 80%. This individual spent 80% of their additional income. Therefore, they saved the rest of it. 1,000 out of 5,000, marginal propensity to save 20%. Again, notice the identity of MPC plus MPS must equal 1. Whatever percentage of the change in income is not spent is saved. Whatever percentage of the change in income is not saved is spent. MPS plus MPC must always equal 1. Look down bottom in the red. We're going to use the marginal propensity to consume or the marginal propensity to save to calculate what is known as the multiplier. More about this important economic concept soon. On the previous slide, marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save was analyzed examining one individual. Let's discuss the nation as a whole. First, identify the change in income for working Americans in the labor force this year. Line number 2 where it says earns an additional 1,000 billion, that works out to be $1 trillion. So disposable income for the United States increases by $1,000 billion. Of that 1,000 billion or trillion, how much is spent and how much is saved? So let's assume Americans spend 800 billion and save 200 billion of the change of 1,000 billion. Again, marginal propensity to consume. Change in consumption over change in income. So in this case, it'll be 800 over 1,000, or 8 over 10. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. On average, Americans spent 80% of their change in income. Therefore, they save the rest. Marginal propensity to save 200 billion over 1,000 billion, or 2 over 10, 20%. Always important to remember, MPC plus MPS must equal 1. If Americans spent 80% of their additional income, their change in income, they saved 20% of their additional income. Marginal propensity to consume 0.8, marginal propensity to save 0.2, 80% plus 20% equals 100% of the change in income. Down at the bottom in red, remember we're going to use either the marginal propensity to consume or the marginal propensity to save to calculate an important economic idea referred to as the multiplier. Jack goes into the jeweler's and spends $5,000 on an engagement ring. GDP increases by 5,000, but the jeweler, he's been waiting to buy his wife a fur coat, so Fred, the jeweler, he goes down to the fur coat store and he buys a fur coat for $4,000. And then the guy who owns the fur coat store, he's been waiting to buy one of those fancy Pelotons because he needs to get back in shape, or he wants to get back into his youthful figure, so he spends $3,200 on a Peloton. What has happened? This idea is what John Maynard Keynes called the multiplier effect. An initial change in spending ultimately has a much larger impact on total GDP. In the previous example, first you have the spending on the engagement ring, then the spending on the fur coat, then the spending on the exercise bike, and so on and so on. The idea of the multiplier was first introduced by Keynes during the Great Depression, not to explain why things were getting better, but to give macroeconomic thinkers a reason or an explanation of why things kept getting worse. So although it has a positive connotation, multiplier, it can work as a positive or a negative influence on the economy. But the idea is vitally important to macroeconomic thinking. Initial changes in spending ultimately have a much larger impact on total GDP. So if you focus your attention down bottom on the equation, total GDP equals multiplier times initial change in spending. So to calculate or at least estimate with numbers the ultimate effect on output, GDP, aggregate production of the economy, how much an initial change in spending creates, we have to have some semblance of an idea of what size is the multiplier. So in this little example, it says, okay, a construction company spends $5 billion on new equipment. That is our number down bottom on the right. That's our initial change in spending. So ABC Construction, they need a giant manufacturing facility. They spend $5 billion on new equipment. That's not the beginning and end to economic activity. That's just the beginning. What's the ultimate impact on total GDP? We're trying to calculate the number on the left, total change in aggregate output in GDP. The only macroeconomic tool that allows us to finish this calculation is if we know the size of the multiplier. Now, we just introduced marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. The size of the marginal propensity to consume, and of course then by default the marginal propensity to save, is going to determine the strength of the multiplier. In the previous slide we introduced the macroeconomic concept of the multiplier. Initial changes in spending ultimately have much larger impact on total change in GDP. To calculate the size of the multiplier or the strength of the multiplier, we can either use the marginal propensity to consume or the marginal propensity to save. By default, if we know one, we know the other. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, the marginal propensity to save must be 0.25. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, the marginal propensity to save is 0.2. But given either one of these, we can calculate the size of the multiplier. Remember, total change in GDP equals the initial change in spending times the multiplier. Several examples will be covered to reinforce this important idea. Students generally aren't the greatest fans of math. This is our little multiplier cheat sheet. 1 over 1 minus MPC equals the multiplier. So if we take 1 over 1 minus 0.9, the multiplier ends up being 10. What do we observe besides the fact that we can work around the math and not have to generate the answer through the formula? There's an important macroeconomic observation on this slide, and it's the following. The greater the marginal propensity to consume, the larger the size of the GDP multiplier. Why? Well, what does marginal propensity to consume measure? It measures what percentage of change in income will the average person spend. So if on average people spend more of their change in income, there'll be a greater multiplied effect given an initial change in spending. It's important to understand the formula, but this slide is excellent for students to review and to check their calculations on the size of the multiplier. Visualizing the step-by-step process of initial change in spending, ultimately creating a much larger change in GDP, often helps students understand the concept of the multiplier. Observe up top, what information do we know? In this example, the marginal propensity to consume in society is 0.75. That is to say, on average, people spend 75% of their change in income. Therefore, on average, people save 25% of their change in income. Can use either formula to calculate the size of the multiplier. 1 over 1 minus MPC, 1 over 1 minus 0.75 works out to be 4. Or 1 over MPS, 1 over marginal propensity to save, 1 over 0.25, again, works out to be 4. We know the multiplier in this economy is 4. Given the information that there's an initial increase in investment spending of $5 billion. See, it says $5, but down bottom it's billion. So the initial change is $5 billion. How much will that ultimately impact GDP? So company ABC spends $5 billion to build a giant manufacturing firm. But then the second round of spending will be 75% of the initial change in spending. And then the third round of spending will be 75% of the second round, and so on and so on. The initial change in spending, $5 billion, creates a much larger impact on total GDP. What is the much larger impact? Ultimately, the initial change in spending creates $20 billion of additional gross domestic product. How do we know that? Well, we could do this tedious long route of round by round calculation, or we can simply take the initial change in spending, $5 billion, times our multiplier, which we calculated to be 4. 5 times 4, the initial increase in investment in a new factory of $5 billion ultimately created $20 billion worth of economic output, total change in GDP. Thus far, we have investigated how changes in spending ultimately impact GDP. When there's an initial change in private sector spending on capital investments, businesses investing in machines, equipment, tools, and factories, there will ultimately be a much larger impact on total GDP. As with government spending, typically during an economic downturn or a recession, government increases spending on roads, bridges, infrastructure projects, building schools and such. However, what happens if the government during an economic downturn decides, instead of initiating fiscal stimulus by increasing spending, decide to introduce a tax cut into the economy? Here's the issue. If the government cuts taxes, workers, members of the labor force, will receive either a check from the government or will pay less in the form of taxes to the government. They will receive more income, but a portion of that tax cut will be saved. Remember, marginal propensity to save. So if the government cuts taxes by $50 billion, the initial change in spending is not $50 billion. It works out to be whatever percentage that $50 billion is spent by taxpayers. And that's determined by the marginal propensity to consume. Therefore, the tax multiplier will be weaker than the spending multiplier. Now, there's a formula to calculate the tax multiplier. If we take the MPC over the MPS, we can then calculate the effectiveness or the strength of the tax multiplier. So if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9 and making the marginal propensity to save 0.1, we take 0.9 over 0.1, and what does that work out to be? Well, there's a little trick here. The tax multiplier ends up being always 1 less than the spending multiplier. So if we are familiar with our previous formula and we like our previous calculations and we're comfortable with understanding how the multiplier is determined using the marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save, you can simply use the little trick of the trade and say, okay, if the spending multiplier is 10, then by default the tax multiplier is 9. So in the example I just gave, marginal propensity to consume 0.9, marginal propensity to save 0.1, 0.9 over 0.1 is 9. But we already know that if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, the spending multiplier is 10. Two things to be aware of. Number one, simple to calculate the tax multiplier because it's always, always, always 1 less than the spending multiplier. Two, and more importantly, Anytime there is a tax cut or reduction in taxes, the ultimate effect on GDP will be less than an increase in spending because some of that tax cut will be saved. The multiplier sheet with questions and answers follows this slide. Little warm-up. Remember, total change in GDP is ultimately calculated by taking the initial change in spending times the multiplier. Question 1 here says, how much will a $20 billion increase in investment spending affect GDP if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9? Step-by-step process. First, calculate the size of the multiplier in this economy. 1 over 1 minus MPC, or 1 over MPS, is the multiplier. So 1 over 1 minus 0.9, 1 over 0.1, the multiplier is 10. So if there is an initial increase of $20 billion in investment spending, 10 times 20, there'll be a total change in GDP of $200 million. Second question presents the concepts from a different format. It says, okay, assume the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, and the government desires a total increase in GDP of $400 billion. So in this problem, you know the total change in GDP. The top left, when we're talking about variables we're trying to calculate. We're trying to calculate what? Initial change in spending in this case, because we're given the total change in GDP. So it says how much government spending is necessary to achieve this desired goal. So the government wants to increase GDP by 400. That's our total change in GDP. Right? What's the multiplier? Well, we're given marginal propensity to consume of 0.8. 1 over 1 minus 0.8. 1 over 0.2, the multiplier is 5. So if the total change in GDP desired by the government is 400, and the multiplier is 5, 400 divided by 5, if the government spends 80 billion in infrastructure spending, they will achieve their desired goal of a total increase of GDP of 400 billion. Practice makes perfect. These 8 questions challenge students to demonstrate a thorough understanding of the marginal propensity to consume, marginal propensity to save, and the multiplier. Take some time to evaluate these 8 questions before moving on and looking at the answers. Drum roll, please. How do we calculate the answers to our multiplier worksheet? Assuming students paused the video and worked on this on their own. Number 1 asks you to calculate the size of the multiplier given various marginal propensities to consume. We simply implement our formula here. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, 1 over 1 minus MPC tells us the size of the multiplier. 0.9, 1 over 1 minus 0.9, multiplier is 10. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, same formula, 1 over 1 minus 0.8, multiplier is 5. Reaffirms an important idea. The larger the marginal propensity to consume, the greater the strength of the multiplier. Again, because larger marginal propensity to consume, people spend more of their additional income. Question 2, same drill from the side of savings. What if we know the marginal propensity to save? What's the size of the multiplier? Formula, 1 over MPS. 1 over the marginal propensity to save determines the size of the multiplier. So 1 over 0.2 equals 5. If people save 20% of their income, the multiplier is 5. If people save slightly more of their income, 0.25, 25%, the multiplier is 4. Question 3 asks you to work backwards. Given the multiplier of 4, how do you calculate the size of the marginal propensity to consume or marginal propensity to save? So 1 over 1 minus 0.75 or 1 over 0.25 equals 4. If the multiplier is 4, the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, marginal propensity to save 0.25. Question 4. This question tells you the government spending $10 billion on infrastructure. That's given. And then it asks you, how much will that ultimately increase GDP? Well, you need to know the size of the multiplier. The question also tells you that in the economy, in question 4, marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. 1 over 1 minus 0.75. the multiplier is there 4. So initial change in spending 10 billion times the multiplier 4, GDP increases by 40 billion when the government spends 10 billion. Question number 5 is important because it emphasizes the idea that Keynes was ultimately trying to teach macroeconomic individuals trying to understand what's going on with the Great Depression. Look at the initial change in spending, question number 5. It says, assume gross business investment declines by 25 billion. What happened in 2008, 2009, because of the financial bubble bursts and because of the housing crisis, businesses weren't too keen on the profitability for the foreseeable future. They cut planned business investment. Private sector spending sent the economy into recession. So a decrease in investment spending of 25 billion with a multiplier of 5 ultimately causes a $125 billion drop in GDP. Question 6 and question 7 are asking the same ultimate outcome from different perspectives. Question 6 says, the government wants to increase GDP by 400 billion. How much do they have to spend? Question 7, the government still wants to increase GDP by 400 billion. How much do they have to cut taxes? Remember, any tax cut will ultimately need to be larger than any increase in spending. Why? Because Frugal Frank and Sally Saver will ultimately save a portion of their tax cuts. Question 6 is simple. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, marginal propensity to save is 0.25, the multiplier is 4. The government spends 100 billion. Ultimately, GDP will increase by 400 billion. How do we calculate the size of the tax multiplier? We can do our fancy-wancy MPC over MPS, or simply remember that the tax multiplier is always 1 less than the spending multiplier. So the government needs to cut taxes by more than 100 billion to get the same bang for their buck, because some people will save a portion of their tax cuts. So 133 billion in tax cuts ultimately causes the same increase in GDP of 400 billion. Take the 400 billion divided by 3, that gets you your 133 billion. How much government needs to cut taxes to get the same increase in total GDP? Question number 8 simply explains everything just covered in question number 6 and 7. Thus far, the focus has been on consumption expenditures and the relationship between disposable income, consumption, and savings. The level of income received by members of the workforce definitely influences economic activity, but the second component of the private sector, investment spending, also plays a huge part in business cycles. To analyze investment spending, economists use what is referred to as the investment demand curve. The investment demand curve demonstrates graphically, numerically, and most importantly economically, the relationship between what we call the expected rate of return and the real rate of interest. So businesses are constantly evaluating, does it make economic sense to expand our capacity, buy more machines, refurbish existing factories, purchase another company, those type of projects, investments. How do they determine if it makes economic sense to expand productive capacity through future investment in capital? Economists have utilized what is referred to as that investment demand curve to demonstrate the entire decision is determined by comparing what is called the expected rate of return versus the real rate of interest. In other business classes, marketing, management, finance, accounting, students are introduced to the calculation of what is called the expected rate of return on a project. Any business will evaluate marketing cost, advertising cost, potential competition in the industry, margins, potential macroeconomic environment before making any business decision. Obviously, the expected rate of return is best guesstimate. Some science, some math, a lot of analytics, and a little bit of luck when it comes to trying to determine next year, next 5 years, next 10 years, how much would a business expect return on their new investment. A typical example might help clarify the idea. Think of Nike Corporation when they just sold sneakers and were contemplating getting into sports apparel markets. They did their due diligence. They looked and said, who are the other players in that market? How large is the market today? Is the market expanding? What type of margins do the existing companies make? What's the economic environment over the next 5 to 10 years? And they determined what would be the expected rate of return on this new strategic business interest. The real rate of interest, introduced in a previous video, the real rate of interest is the difference between what we call the nominal rate and the expected rate of inflation over some period of time. So if a company can borrow money at 8% and they expect inflation to be 2% over that time, let's use 10-year period for the horizon. Company's going to borrow money for 10 years. They borrow at 8%, but they expect inflation to be 2%. The nominal rate, the stated rate, 8%, minus the expected rate of inflation over that annual time. So annually, inflation averages about 2%. The real rate of interest is therefore 6%. And they build a rule, a law, an economic rationale to determine, does this investment, does this endeavor, does this new strategic business make economic sense? And the rule is straightforward. Investment makes sense as long as the expected rate of return on the new project is greater than the real rate of interest. So we've explained what we mean by expected rate of return. We explained by what we mean about the real rate of interest. From here on in, think of R as the real rate of interest and equate R equals I to the idea that an investment makes sense if and only if the expected rate of return on that new project is greater than or equal to the real rate of interest. The ideas introduced qualitatively on the previous slide will now be examined quantitatively, numerically, on the left-hand side with some data, and the right-hand side, the investment demand curve. Before we construct the investment demand curve, as always when examining any model, be certain to identify what's being measured on each axis. The horizontal axis is simple. The amount of planned business investment that we would expect to take place in billions of dollars, 5, 10, 15, 20, 35, 40 billions of dollars of potential investment. The vertical axis, notice it says the real rate of interest and the expected rate of return. What rule was established on the previous slide? A new business investment, a new project, a new strategic business unit, investment in new machines, equipment, expanding the plant capacity makes sense if the expected rate of return on said project is greater than the real rate of interest. Here are the numbers we use to graph our investment or construct our investment demand curve. First, what's the most important observation? Higher interest rates, less investment. Lower interest rates, more investment. Why? Because if a company needs to borrow at 14%, extremely high interest rates, remember that's the real rate of interest, nominal rate minus expected inflation over the duration of the loan, it's going to be challenging to find business projects that have a real rate of return or expected rate of return of greater than 14%. Lower interest rates entice businesses to borrow and invest. So interest rates are the opportunity cost that businesses must consider when trying to determine if it makes economic sense to expand capacity, to invest in new machines, to start some new business. This information allows us to graph the investment demand curve. Notice the downward sloping investment demand curve. At an interest rate of 10%, which is rather high, planned business investment is $15 billion. When interest rates fall, there's more business investment. Now remember, the multiplier was covered earlier in this video. So if interest rates fall from 10% to 8%, more projects now have an expected rate of return greater than that new real rate of interest. There'll be an additional $5 billion in investment spending. That will be the catalyst for the beginning of an increase in output. The multiplier effect will ultimately have a say on how much GDP expands in total. Another quick observation. The expected rate of return relationship to the real rate of interest makes economic sense regardless of whether or not the company needs to borrow the money. Let's go back to the Nike example discussed earlier. Let's assume, easy number to remember, $100 million necessary to make this business proposal reality. Not sure if that's an accurate number, but it's easy for us to analyze. So $100 million necessary to get into the clothing, sports apparel industry, right? Let's assume that Nike has the $100 million on its balance sheet as an asset, and therefore they don't need to borrow the cash. They don't need to borrow. They don't need to go into the loanable funds market and borrow. Do they still consider the real rate of interest versus the expected rate of return? So let's assume that the business model expectations determine that there's a potential rate of return of 8% on this project. So Nike determines that after analyzing existing players, cost to get into the industry, advertising, the profit margins, that over the next 10 years they can earn 8% on sports apparel. Let's assume the real rate of interest in the economy is 10%. But Nike doesn't need to borrow the money. They have the $100 million in cash. Remember, the opportunity cost. What else could the company do as far as their financial well-being? Instead of borrowing the money, the company could lend the money at the real rate of interest. So the real rate of interest is always going to be the determinant of whether business projects make economic sense. General rule, as long as the expected rate of return on a project is greater than the real rate of interest, that project makes economic sense. There is a direct relationship between the real rate of interest and the amount of planned business investment, but other factors influence how much corporations, companies want to spend on new projects, machinery, and equipment. First one being the durability, or how long the capital lasts. During economic doldrums or downturns, companies will eke out as much from existing machinery as possible before investing into new capital. Obviously, the economics is driven by profitability based on the macroeconomic environment. Eventually, machines get to the point where they need to be replaced, but during economic downturns, companies can postpone capital investment for some time. Irregularity of innovation. Two good examples of this. In the early 90s, computerization in the internet took managers by storm. Industries were overwhelmed by the efficiency that could be injected into their systems with these two tools. So that period of innovation was accompanied by an enormous leap in capital investment in the computers and networking equipment necessary to take full advantage of these efficiencies. Another example is what's taking place right now with the transformation into greener energies. If you look at specifically the solar energy and how when new construction takes place, building contractors, architects, engineers are incorporating solar panels into the construction based on the long run economic efficiency of consuming and using the energy. The last idea here, variability of profits and expectations, just straightforward, obvious here. Any economic events which alter profitability's potential for the good or the bad is going to affect the amount of investment spending that businesses undertake. Final thoughts on gross business investment. We're going to examine the volatility of investment relative to GDP over time. Looking at this chart, blue represents GDP, gross domestic product. Red represents investment spending, the amount of money that small, medium-sized, and giant corporations want to spend on capital, manufactured aids, and tools used in the productive process. Important conclusion from this observation. Remember, investment is only 16% of GDP, but it is a vitally important driver or indicator on where the economy is heading, because investment spending ultimately impacts jobs and output and economic well-being of the nation. It is time to combine all the macroeconomic principles covered thus far, including measuring economic output, adjusting nominal GDP for real GDP, economic growth, business cycle, unemployment, inflation, and the macroeconomic relationships just covered, and construct the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. This is the tool used by economists to analyze current state of U.S. economy, concentrating on our three important macroeconomic variables: output, aka GDP, unemployment, and price level, aka inflation. This is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Whenever presented with a new economic model, start by identifying what is measured on each axis. On the horizontal axis, simultaneously measuring two of the three important macroeconomic variables. Real GDP, remember, real GDP is nominal GDP or economic output adjusted for change in the price level, and unemployment. So moving left to right on the horizontal axis, economic production, economic output, GDP is increasing. As the economy produces more, the level of unemployment falls. More people are working. That's the horizontal axis. Vertical axis, price level. Many different approaches to measuring the general price level. Most commonly reported CPI, Consumer Price Index. For simplicity, continue to assume price level on the vertical axis represented by the Consumer Price Index. Obviously, we briefly discussed the Producer Price Index and Personal Consumption Expenditures Index used by the Federal Reserve. Good enough is good enough here. All right, we got on this graph AD and AS. What do they represent? AD, aggregate demand. What is that? It's the total amount of output that all buyers collectively desire at the price level. The key here is who are all buyers. AD, aggregate demand, is consumption expenditures, gross business investment, government expenditures, and exports. Aggregate demand, all four components of spending. Remember, we emphasized the importance of the expenditures approach and also informed learners this expenditures approach would be important down the road. Aggregate demand is the total amount of real output that all buyers would desire to purchase at the given price level in the economy. Aggregate supply. This is the short run aggregate supply curve. We're going to concentrate 97% of our efforts on the short run aggregate supply. Aggregate supply, the total amount of real output that all producers want to make available at the given price level. So aggregate supply represents potential output of all economic goods and services production. We bring them together and we have what's called macroeconomic equilibrium. vitally important idea here. Macroeconomic equilibrium. As pictured on this slide, the economy is operating exactly in the most desired situation. GDP is growing at or near around 3%. Unemployment is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4%. And price level or inflation is about 2%. We call this the Goldilocks scenario. More formally, it's referred to as full employment domestic output. Full employment domestic output simply means the economy is operating, firing on all cylinders at or near the levels most desired by all interested parties. GDP is growing close to our long-run average rate of growth. Unemployment's at the natural rate of unemployment, and price level is perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. The purpose of studying this model is to analyze how changes in aggregate demand or aggregate supply will alter or change the situation with our three macroeconomic variables, and then discuss how fiscal and monetary policy are utilized by government and the Federal Reserve to influence the economy or to have an impact on the economic situation when things aren't as pictured here, aren't as perfect. Let's examine aggregate demand. What is aggregate demand? The amount of real output that all buyers collectively want to purchase at the given price level. Fancy way of saying CIGX, all buyers. Consumer expenditures on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Gross business investment, machines, equipment, projects, plant, any type of manufacturing aids or tools purchased by businesses to assist with the productive process, investment spending, government spending, and exports. Collectively, all four components of spending make up aggregate demand. The downward sloping demand curve demonstrates the inverse relationship between total aggregate demand, total spending, and the general price level in the economy. What is the rationale behind the downward sloping aggregate demand curve? Having seen this visually on the previous slide, that aggregate demand is the amount of real output that CIGX, all buyers, collectively desire to purchase at the given or general price level in the economy. What is the economic rationale for the downward sloping aggregate demand curve? First, the real balances effect. Imagine if someone gave you $100,000 and said, congratulations, this is all yours. Here's the bad news. You're not permitted to spend a nickel of it for an entire year. It must stay in a safe, in a place in your home that's hidden where no one can steal it from you. Now, what would be bad for you over the course of the next 365 days? If inflation increases significantly, the real balance of that cash, the real purchasing power has declined. So an increase in the price level decreases the real balance of cash equivalents. Obviously, if the general price level had declined, purchasing power had gone up. That's one of the reasons why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The second reason or rationale for the downward sloping aggregate demand curve, the interest rate effect. Graphical analysis will help us understand the interest rate effect. Here is the graph of the domestic money market. Whenever presented with a new graph, be certain to identify what's being measured on each axis. Horizontal axis, quantity of money demanded and supplied. Vertical axis, not the price of money, the interest rate. Remember, certain sectors of spending highly interest rate sensitive. Interest rates vitally important to economic activity in the good old U.S. economy. Higher interest rates slow spending on cars and homes by peoples and reduce investment spending because, as just covered with the investment demand curve, fewer projects where the expected rate of return is greater than the real rate of interest. So let's look at first the orange money supply, vertical up and down supply of money. The Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank, controls the money supply. At any point in time, there's a fixed amount of money in the economy. In a later episode of Economic Learning, we'll discuss the Fed increasing or decreasing the money supply, based on macroeconomic conditions. For now, money supply is fixed as pictured on our graph. The demand for money. Human beings need money to facilitate every transaction which takes place in the economy. Focus first at I1. Assume that's 4% interest. So there's a certain demand for money, certain supply of money. Where they come together, we have I1, 4% interest. Now the price of everything in the economy goes up. Food, milk, bread, eggs, gasoline, housing. When the price of goods and services increases, there's an increase in demand for money, need more money to consume the same amount of goods and services, pushes the interest rate up. In our example, it goes from I1 to I2. Let's assume that's 4% to 6%. Now there'll be less spending by consumers on automobiles and housing, and businesses will cut back on investment spending. So the second rationale for the downward sloping aggregate demand curve, the interest rate effect. Third reason why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. Already covered the real balances effect. Just explained the interest rate effect, graphically assisted with the money market graph. Now the foreign purchases effect. Citizens in other countries can purchase goods and services produced domestically, or they could purchase U.S. exports. General idea is pretty straightforward here. If a person living in another country finds prices in the United States more appealing, there'll be more exports. If prices in the United States go up, higher general price level in the United States, fewer exports. Add them all together, real balance effect, interest rate effect, foreign purchase effect gives shape to our downward sloping aggregate demand curve. The study of markets covered earlier in the course emphasized the importance of mastering demand and supply as the tools economists use to analyze markets. We discussed in detail any events or factors which would shift, increase, or decrease demand and supply. In a similar vein, going to investigate what would cause an increase or a decrease in aggregate demand. But first, notice when there is a change in total spending, aggregate demand, there's an initial increase in aggregate demand from AD to AD ... and eventually we end up at AD2. Why? Why is there an initial shift to the right, an increase in aggregate demand, and then a total shift? This is the multiplier working its magic in the total economy, in the aggregate. So if there were a $5 billion increase in investment spending, remember that's the beginning, not the total impact or effect on spending. And likewise, there will be factors that decrease aggregate demand, shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Both increases and decreases in aggregate demand will ultimately have significant impact on our three macroeconomic variables: GDP, unemployment, and inflation. When analyzing what factors will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, increase aggregate demand, or shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, decrease in aggregate demand, economists need to break total spending into the four components, C, I, G, and X, and investigate each of them separately as to how each of the four components will either increase or decrease aggregate demand. Let's start with consumer expenditures and discuss the four factors from the standpoint of household spending, which will either increase or decrease aggregate demand. The first one is consumer wealth, or the wealth effect, highly correlated to the performance of financial markets, aka the stock market. A booming stock market puts money in people's pockets, gives them economic confidence, makes individuals, households feel better about their financial picture. When the stock market goes through a year to 5 of what is called a bull market, generally speaking, that increases aggregate demand. Individuals and households feel better about their economic scenario, spending more on vacations and other types of discretionary spending. When there's a smart stock market bust, the opposite happens. So if you look at two periods in U.S. economic history, from 1992 through 2000 was the dot-com era bull market. 7 or 8 years of excellent market returns. That wealth built up in individual households' portfolios ultimately increased aggregate demand. In 2001, the stock market, or really at the end of the year 2000, the dot-com era bubble burst. The bubble bursting dropped the values of stock, especially NASDAQ, decreasing the confidence of households and decreasing aggregate demand. Typically, for the most people, their largest financial asset is their home. So the amount of household indebtedness will highly impact aggregate demand. Going to use a numerical example to demonstrate the importance of this idea. Eventually we'll discuss consumer expectations and taxes, but let's examine household indebtedness in more detail. Most people who purchase a home do not pay for the house outright. Typically, individuals finance the purchase of a home. The typical arrangement is to put 20% down as a down payment and finance 80% of the home. And the most common financial instruments used by households to finance the purchase of a house is the 15 or 30-year fixed rate mortgage. These are common loans used by everyday people to buy a house. An example helps solidify this idea. Focus attention on the left where it says the year is 1998. Joe Q. Public, Jane Q. Public purchases a home for $180,000. They do not pay $180,000 outright. They put a $30,000 down payment on the home and finance $150,000. So they're taking out a mortgage for $150,000. Most common mortgage is the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. How does this operate? The borrower agrees to pay the bank back 360 equal payments, 30 times 12. And why does the payment remain the same? It's a fixed rate mortgage. In this example, the interest rate is 7.875%. That was the going interest rate on a fixed rate mortgage in 1998. If you look at an amortization schedule, the way it works, payment number 1 is mostly interest. Only a little bit of that mortgage payment, $1,088, is going towards principal. Payment number 2, that relationship changes a little bit. A little less towards interest and a little more towards principal. After years of paying, it's going to be the opposite. In year 28, most of the payment is going to principal and very little going to interest. But the payment itself will remain the same. Quick summary. Joe Q. Public buys a house in 1998. House price was $180. Got a mortgage for $150. Borrowed $150 against the value of the house. Put a down payment of $30,000. 30-year fixed rate mortgage, agrees to pay $1,088 per month for the next 360 months to pay off the house. Focus your attention on the right. Between 1998 and 2006, 8 years later, the home value increased to $340,000. How did that happen? That's the way housing markets operate. So prices of homes increased across the country. Most areas experienced a major increase in the value of houses, residential homes. Now, a bank will allow you to borrow 80% of the value of a home. Homeowners can participate in what's called a cash out refinance. The way it works, the borrower, the lender, the homeowner needs to go through rigorous credit check and paperwork for the bank to determine that they're still a good risk as far as the liability, has income, has a good job, right, has a good credit history and such. The bank's always going to let you borrow 80% of the value of the house. Key factor here is, look at interest rates between 1998 and 2006. Interest rates plummeted from 7.875% to 3.625%. So the bank is not going to take your word that your house is worth $340,000. They will definitely send out some expert to do what's called an appraisal. Let's assume the appraisal comes in exactly at $340,000. The bank will let you borrow 80% of that. So here's what happens. The homeowner who bought the house in 1998 gets a new mortgage for 260,000. Right there it says loan amount on the right. They still owe money on the previous loan. It says 140 pay off balance from first mortgage. So new loan wipes out the old loan by paying off the remaining balance. Now there are these things called closing costs. If you originate a mortgage, you typically have to pay for a title search and all kinds of fees and such. Going to just estimate this. This is close enough, rather accurate. $260,000 for the new loan, $140,000 to pay off the old loan, $10,000 to go through these costs. The homeowner literally walks away with $110,000 cash. Bottom line on the right. Now this is tax-free money that the person simply took the equity out of their house. Of course, they have a new mortgage. Right? The amount of their new mortgage, they owe $260,000, but they have $110,000 in cash they can spend however they wish. Another key factor here is look at the total payment, the monthly payment. On the left, the monthly payment for the 30-year fixed rate mortgage at 7.875% on $150,000 was $1,088. Because interest rates declined so much, the payment on the new mortgage is only $1186, only $98 more than the original mortgage. So this person is paying only $100 more roughly per month to finance their home and walked away with $110,000 in cash. Think about the spending ability, the power of aggregate demand, because this is not the only person performing this cash out refinance. Millions of Americans were participating in this same financial approach to taking the equity out of their home to generate spending power. How they spent it, lots of questions. You could have bought another house and used the money, a small, condo, and used the money from the rental to pay off your loan every month. Could have put the money back into your house to redo your kitchen and your basement and such. Could have invested in the stock market. But you do see the spending power on home indebtedness, household indebtedness. Individuals across the country were able to tap into the equity of their homes, which generated a significant increase in aggregate demand. The previous example explains how household indebtedness can be a significant driver of aggregate demand. Between 2000 and 2007, home prices increased across the country, interest rates declined, lots of households participated in cash-out refinance programs, tapping into the equity of their houses, which significantly increased aggregate demand. Unleashed lots of spending, which made its way into the economy. In 2007, the housing bubble burst. House prices dropped dramatically. Lots of individuals across the country found themselves underwater with their home ownership, which meant the value of their house was worth less than the money owed against it. Imagine if a person's holding a mortgage, $325,000, and now the house is worth $210,000. That negative household indebtedness, serious drag on the economy, significant decline in aggregate demand. Lots of people who were speculators in home ownership simply walked away from houses, which caused even more pain in the housing market. So household indebtedness definitely drives aggregate demand. Consumer expectations. Every year, every month, University of Michigan releases what is known as the Consumer Confidence Index. Psychological well-being regarding financial standing impacts aggregate demand. People feel better about their job and their overall economic situation, tend to spend more on discretionary spending. When people feel worse about their financial standing, aggregate demand declines. Believe it or not, consumer expectations has a big impact on the economy. Consumer wealth, household indebtedness, consumer expectations. Final one is taxes. Cover this in more detail when we talk about fiscal policy, but long story short, increasing taxes on individuals/households removes disposable income from the economy, drag on aggregate demand. Any decrease in taxes will put more money in people's pockets, more disposable income, increase in aggregate demand. Gross business investment, purchases of machines, equipment, tools, factories, new projects, logistics systems, extremely important component of GDP. Investment spending, only 16% of total spending, but investment drives economic activity as businesses signal to the macroeconomic community their vision of profitability for the foreseeable future. Already covered, but important to reaffirm the economics of the investment demand curve. Businesses will constantly weigh the real rate of interest versus the expected rate of return. Interest rates drive investment spending. Lower interest rates entice businesses to borrow and invest in new projects. Higher interest rates stifle investment spending. Many factors impact expected rate of return. Most importantly, businesses will evaluate their standing in their industry and the macroeconomic picture to determine their belief on what a reasonable rate of return would be on new projects. Presented numerically on the left and graphically on the right, the relationship between the expected rate of return and the real rate of interest. Lower interest rates increase investment spending. Notice that a low interest rate of 4%, total amount of investment spending $30 billion. At a much higher interest rate, 12%, investment spending falls all the way to $10 billion. The Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank, controls interest rates. Further down the road in our study of macroeconomics, much more detailed explanation of how and why the Fed increases interest rates based on macroeconomic conditions, but businesses will constantly weigh the potential profitability of new projects through their calculation of expected rate of return versus the real rate of interest. Government spending is 18% of GDP. Government takes an active role in managing the state of the economy. Economists refer to this as fiscal policy. A deeper investigation into discretionary fiscal policy, active changes in government spending aimed at influencing aggregate demand is the focus of the next video. Not skipping government spending, emphasizing its importance. Next video. How about net exports? What factors will influence foreigners' desire to purchase U.S. exports? National income abroad. Important economic lesson here. It's not us against them. It's not the United States against Europe or Japan or South Korea or South America. A rising tide lifts all boats. It's best when economies around the world do better domestically because they purchase more of their own goods and services, but they buy more U.S. exports. So when citizens around the world have more money to spend because their economies are performing well, it's good for the United States. Obviously, when an economic contraction affects countries around the globe, less U.S. exports, less aggregate demand. In addition to national incomes abroad and how increases in aggregate demand are influenced by a better economy and vice versa, exchange rates will also impact how much exports take place in the United States. Generally speaking, other things equal, if the dollar depreciates, that is to say, if the dollar weakens against the value of our trading partners, it makes U.S. exports less expensive to citizens of other countries. Stronger dollar makes U.S. exports more expensive to citizens in other countries. Over the course of the last 18 to 24 months, it's now April 2023, the dollar has strengthened rather significantly against other currencies. This has been a drag on aggregate demand from the standpoint of the U.S. economy. Stronger dollar making U.S. exports relatively more expensive to individuals living in other countries. Quick review of aggregate demand before moving on to aggregate supply. What is aggregate demand? Total amount of real output that all buyers, C, I, G, and X, collectively want to purchase at the given price level. Consumer expenditures, durable goods, non-durable goods, services, gross business investment, machines, equipment, tools, factories, government spending, and exports. Inverse relationship between the general price level in the economy and the amount of real output that all those buyers desire to purchase. Remember, why is the aggregate demand curve downward sloping? 3 factors: the real balances effect, the interest rate effect, the foreign purchases effect. What factors would shift the aggregate demand? Well, first, assume we start at AD in the middle. An increase in aggregate demand is a rightward shift from AD to AD2, the black curve towards the blue curve. A decrease in aggregate demand is a shift from AD to AD1, leftward shift from the black curve to the red curve. The 4 factors which would increase or decrease aggregate demand from the standpoint of consumer expenditures: consumer wealth effect, household indebtedness, taxes, and consumer confidence. Anything that affects those factors will increase or decrease aggregate demand. I component of GDP, what will influence aggregate demand, increasing aggregate demand or decrease aggregate demand from the standpoint of gross business investment, that relationship between the real rate of interest and the expected rate of return. So lower interest rates, more aggregate demand from investment spending, higher interest rates, less aggregate demand, and the profitability of expectations also changes the outlook. Government spending will be the focus of fiscal policy. Next chapter. Finally, exports. Booming economies around the world increase the demand for exports, shift from AD to AD2. Economies struggling around the world, less U.S. exports, shift from AD to AD1, decrease in aggregate demand. Finally, exchange rates. A weaker dollar makes U.S. exports more attractive to foreigners, increase in aggregate demand, and the opposite is true for a stronger dollar. On to aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is the amount of real output that all producers desire to make available for sale at the given price level. So up top, the basic explanation: the level of output, level of real output that all producers desire to make available for sale at the given price level. Going to distinguish between the long-run aggregate supply curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve. Vitally important for students to understand, 98% of our focus will be on the short-run aggregate supply curve to analyze what's taking place in the economy today and what needs to be done if we are not operating at full employment domestic output. First, a brief explanation of the long-run aggregate supply curve. What's the relationship between wages and resource prices in the long run? Notice it says wages and resource prices match in the long run. Think back to the production possibility frontier. How much output will producers want to make available for sale if everything is running smoothly? Well, operating on all cylinders, we call that full employment domestic output. In the long run, notice that the aggregate supply curve is vertical. Vertical meaning that how much output will businesses produce? How much will firms make available for sale? They will make available for sale the amount they can, given limited land, capital, and labor resources and fixed technology. So when things are operating well, in the long run, the economy operates at or near our capacity to produce in the long run. Understanding that aggregate supply measures the amount of real output that producers want to make available for sale at the given price level, and knowing that in the long run, what classical economists refer to as full employment output, producers will make available for sale the amount of output that land, capital, and labor limitations will dictate. What happens in the short run? In the long run, we have this nice match where wages and resource prices match. In the short run, we have this mismatch. Wages and resource prices are out of sync, out of sorts. Let's examine the short run aggregate supply curve. The exaggerated or extended short run aggregate supply curve drives home this idea of the mismatch between wages and resource prices in the short run. Notice the names of these three ranges of the short run aggregate supply curve: the Keynesian range, the intermediate range, and the classical range. Keynes was an economist who wrote extensively during the Great Depression and is respected among macroeconomists as one of the fathers of many macroeconomic relationships and modern thinking about how we view the economy. Keynesian range, there's a significant amount of excess capacity. Land, capital, labor, slack, not much demand for these resources. The economy is not operating anywhere near its potential output. In the intermediate range, economic activity is much better. Capacity utilization is near our maximum. Demand for resources much stronger. Eventually, the economy reaches the classical range. In the short run, the economy only has a limited capacity to produce. Scarce, limited resources and fixed technology means we hit the proverbial wall. That's why the classical range is vertical. Eventually, we would reach our maximum level of potential economic output. The extended or exaggerated short run aggregate supply curve examined on the previous slide, an excellent learning tool. Typically, we don't operate at the extremes. Here we have the usual version of the short run aggregate supply curve, this upward sloping relationship between the amount of real output that producers desire to make available at the given price level. But falling back on our exaggerated tool to emphasize the economics of the short run aggregate supply curve, it's important to discuss what factors will shift the aggregate supply curve. So what would cause an increase in aggregate supply, a rightward shift in aggregate supply? Any factor which would increase the quantity or quality of resources, or an improvement in productivity / technology. Those are drivers of economic growth, vitally important to our future economic well-being. So think of a rightward shift to the aggregate supply curve as excellent for the economy. Again, any improvement in the quality of resources or any increase in the quantity of resources, any improvement in productivity. Productivity measures output per unit of input. So if a factory can eke out more output, more production from the same number of workers, that's an increase in productivity. Technology and improvements in technology drive economic growth. Rightward shift to the aggregate supply curve, excelente. Leftward shift to the aggregate supply curve, not as so good, not good, not good. So what would decrease aggregate supply? First, this is referred to as a negative supply shock. Negative supply shock. So any significant increase in factors of production, aka oil, an important resource for the economic engine of countries operating around the world, and any disruption in supply chain as demonstrated by the pandemic. So in the 70s, there was an oil supply shock. OPEC squeezed supply, decreasing the amount of this vital resource available around the globe. That caused a negative supply shock, a decrease from AS1 towards AS3. And the pandemic economy, with the disruption to the supply chain, the efficient supply chain that operated for years, leftward shift in aggregate supply. Quick review of the factors which will shift the aggregate supply curve. Any increase in the quantity or quality of land, capital, labor, or the entrepreneur will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right, increase aggregate supply. Any increase in the price of resources or disruption in the availability of resources will shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. Productivity impacts aggregate supply. Improvements in productivity will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Technological advancements, lots of research being done in energy and the production of energy from renewable sources, lots of battery technology, exploration lately, any factor which increases the ability to generate more output per unit of input, increases in productivity, will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Legal environment, legal structure, an important determinant of aggregate supply. One country which is now embracing a more favorable legal environment for production, India, understanding they need to embrace opportunities to create more employment in their country, definitely becoming more friendly towards businesses and foreign investment. Subsidies are taxes in reverse. Think of the recent bill passed by the Biden administration. Its name, the Inflation Reduction Act, really doesn't do justice to the actual intentions of the bill. Most of the monies in the bill are aimed at spending on new energy projects to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, solar, wind, anything which would be environmentally friendly. Lots of subsidies to these industries. That would shift aggregate supply curve to the right. Finally, government regulation. Any regulation which prohibits exploration and distribution of resources will stifle economic growth. For instance, reducing the possibility of oil exploration and output by canceling something like the Keystone Pipeline, that will actually reduce aggregate supply. Revisiting aggregate demand, aggregate supply model of the economy from exactly where we started. Aggregate demand, the amount of real output that all buyers desire to purchase at a given price level. Aggregate supply, in the short run, the amount of real output that all producers want to make available for sale. The purpose of the model is to examine what is referred to as macroeconomic equilibrium. The importance of macroeconomic equilibrium determine what's going on with our three variables of concern, of interest. What's going on with aggregate output, aka real GDP? How much is the economy producing? What is the unemployment rate? How many people have jobs versus what is the desired level of employment for the economy? And what's the general price level in the economy? What's inflation? As pictured in this aggregate demand, aggregate supply scenario, assuming this is a snapshot of the economy today, everything is perfect. This is the Goldilocks scenario. This is referred to as full employment domestic output. When aggregate demand is at equilibrium with aggregate supply as pictured here, the economy is growing at or near our long-run target of 3%. Unemployment is right around full employment number, so there's only frictional and structural unemployment, no cyclical unemployment, 4% unemployment, and inflation is perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. General price level, as measured by the CPI, is increasing at 2%. Now, if this is perfect or perfection, 4 things can happen and 3 of them are bad. Next few slides will analyze what happens to macroeconomic equilibrium in our 3 variables when there are shifts in the curve. The stock market declines by 20%. Negative impact on the consumer wealth effect. The value of homes declines by 15%. Household indebtedness worries homeowners. Business confidence wanes significantly, reducing the profitability outlook for gross business investment in projects, machines, equipment, tools, factories. These factors shift aggregate demand to the left. Decrease in aggregate demand. Everything was perfect at point A on the curve. Full employment domestic output, 3% economic growth, 4% unemployment, 2% inflation. Now what happened? From QF to Q2, we've had a recession. GDP falls. Contracting GDP causes unemployment to rise. And we have some disinflation, not deflation. That is to say, prices are still in the positive level, but there's definitely no upward pressure on prices. So a decrease in aggregate demand caused by any of the factors which shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Falling real output, the economy is contraction, real GDP, negative relative to where we were. Unemployment rising, we now have cyclical unemployment. And inflation is not a worry, maybe slightly below 2%, definitely not the problem at the moment. Assume we start at hunky-dory, happy-go-lucky, perfect full employment domestic output. Again, QF, P1. QF meaning full employment domestic output, P1, 2% inflation. So the economy is growing at 2.8%, unemployment is 3.9%, price level 2.1%, everything is perfect. Too much money spending too few goods. Spending increases beyond the economy's ability to keep up with output. Too much money chasing too few goods. Demand pull inflation. From QF to Q1, the economy might actually grow a bit. Unemployment might actually come down. But look what happens to price level. P1, the acceptable level of inflation, 2%. The economy is now experiencing 6% inflation. Demand pull inflation. Aggregate demand has shifted to the right. An increase in spending beyond full employment output forces price level up in the economy. GDP is not the issue. The level of employment is not the problem. It's just that inflation is above an acceptable level. Now, the worst case scenario, a negative supply shock. Again, 1973 and shades of this during the pandemic, but let's talk about 1970s, oil embargo, negative supply shock. Assume we're at A on our curve. The economy is growing at about 2.78%, unemployment 3.8%, price level 2.2%, full employment domestic output, everything is good. All of a sudden the price of oil increases from $2 a barrel to $10 a barrel. Negative supply shock, leftward shift in aggregate supply, cost push inflation, negative supply shock. All three macroeconomic variables moving in the wrong direction. This is the absolute worst case for the economy. From QF to Q1, GDP has contracted. We're in a recession. From QF to Q1, fewer goods and services produced, unemployment rises. Now the economy has some level of cyclical unemployment. But at the same time, we have less outputs, recession, and more unemployment. Look what happened to price level. P1 to P2, we actually have inflation during an economic downturn. The term economists used for this in the 70s was stagflation. Stagflation. Weaker economy with higher unemployment at the same time, increase in price level. Again, cost push inflation, worst case scenario for the economy. Cost push inflation, worst case scenario, falling GDP, higher unemployment, inflation at the same time, higher price levels. Let's end this video on a positive note. Let's talk about the best case scenario, that is a rightward shift in aggregate supply. So any increase in productivity, any increase in the quantity or quality of resources will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Assume we start at Q1, P1. Let's assume that that's full employment domestic output. Unemployment's 4.1%. The economy is growing at 2.75%, and the price level is 2.1%. Everything's looking pretty good. And then the innovation of computerization in the 90s, or in 2008 when America perfected directional drilling and fracking to release lots of domestic sources of energy. So either an increase in technology or an improvement in the quantity of resources shifts the aggregate supply curve to the right. This causes what's referred to as non-inflationary economic growth. The economy is growing, more jobs are available, but at the same time, we don't have the ugly byproduct of inflation. The United States has actually increased the capacity to produce more, which brings more occupational opportunities without putting any upward pressure on prices. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video.